You felt it, didn't you? Not just the ending. Not just the silence after their voice disappeared from your life. There was something deeper beneath it. Something that didn't sit right in your spirit. It wasn't just heartbreak. It felt like something was taken. Something disturbed. Something that crossed a line you couldn't fully explain, but couldn't ignore either. Because what you experienced wasn't ordinary. It wasn't just two people drifting apart. It carried a weight, a distortion, like your truth was twisted, like your pain was dismissed, like your reality was quietly rewritten while you were still living inside it. And somewhere deep within you there was a voice that refused to accept the surface explanation, a knowing that what happened wasn't random, and definitely not harmless. They may have acted like it was nothing, like your emotions were exaggerated, like your questions were inconvenient, like your presence was replaceable. But what they overlooked, what they underestimated, was the depth of what you carry. Because when someone tries to diminish something, real, something rare, something sincere, the impact doesn't just disappear into thin air. It echoes. Every moment you stayed quiet when you wanted to speak. Every time you questioned yourself instead of them. Every piece of your heart that was handled carelessly. None of it vanished. It settled somewhere deeper, somewhere that keeps record not in bitterness, but in truth. And truth doesn't forget. You don't need to chase closure to validate what you already felt. You don't need their admission to confirm what your soul already recognized. Because the imbalance you experienced wasn't imagined. It was real. And anything real leaves a mark not just on you, but on the space between you. And that seiwa is not empty. You can feel it already. 8 of Cups is the quiet turning point, where something inside you decides to walk away. Not because it's easy, but because staying would cost your soul. There's a stillness in that image, a figure choosing distance over illusion, stepping away from what once held meaning but no longer holds truth. The cups remain, the memories remain, but something deeper has shifted. The sun and moon both present as if even the universe is witnessing this departure, not as defeat, but as a necessary release. And maybe that's what this was all along. Not abandonment, not loss, but the moment your spirit chose itself even before your mind could understand why. Ace of Wands arrives reversed in that exact space where something once sparked but was mishandled, where a flame was offered, and then distorted where potential was present, but misused. You can almost see it, a glowing hand reaching out holding a wand that should have ignited creation, but instead flickers unevenly restrained, misdirected. The energy was there. The opportunity was real, but the alignment was off. And that matters more than you think. Because what you gave wasn't small. It wasn't casual. It wasn't something that could be dismissed without consequence. You brought warmth presence, a kind of ignition that doesn't come often. You brought a beginning disguised as love. And when something like that is mishandled, it doesn't just fade away, it redirects. That's why the aftermath feels so uneven. You walked away carrying questions, maybe even fragments of doubt, wondering if you misread everything. Meanwhile, they walked away thinking it was over, thinking they could simply move forward untouched. But what they didn't understand is that energy doesn't conclude when people decide it does. It continues until it resolves. And resolution doesn't always look immediate. Sometimes it looks like a delay, a pause, a stretch of time where nothing seems to happen. But under that stillness, recalibration begins. The same force that witnessed your confusion is now organizing what was disrupted. Not with noise, not with drama, but with quiet, exact correction. That's why you don't need to chase answers. Because what was misused is already being addressed not through punishment, but through consequence. The same way a fire either warms or burns, depending on how it's handled, the connection you shared is now revealing its true nature through what follows. And here is the part that shifts everything. You weren't the one who lost direction. You were the one who felt the misalignment first. You were the one who sensed that something wasn't flowing the way it should. That intuitive discomfort you carried. That wasn't weakness. That was awareness. They ignored it. You honored it. And that single difference changes the entire outcome. Because now, while you are slowly stepping into clarity, they are left holding something they didn't understand how to use. A spark that no longer responds. A space that no longer opens the way it once did. And no matter how they try to recreate what they had, something essential is missing. Not because you took it, but because they didn't recognize it when it was there. And that recognition cannot be forced after the fact. It can only be learned through absence. 5 of Swords rises in that exact space the moment where truth begins to surface, but not gently. You can almost see it, blades suspended in the air tension, lingering, a figure holding one weapon, while others remain pointed in every direction. No clear victory, no clean ending, just the quiet realization that something was taken at a cost no one fully understood. Because what happened between you wasn't just conflict, it was misalignment dressed as connection. Words said without accountability, actions taken without care for consequence. And beneath it all, a subtle but undeniable attempt to gain control, rather than build understanding. That's why it left a mark that didn't fade easily. It wasn't just disagreement, it was distortion. And you felt that distortion long before you could name it. There were moments when something didn't sit right, when conversations felt like they bent reality instead of clarifying it. When you found yourself explaining your own feelings as if they needed permission to exist. That wasn't love finding its way. That was clarity being slowly challenged. And still you tried. You tried to meet them halfway. You tried to restore balance where it kept slipping. But every time you reached for resolution, something shifted just enough to keep things unclear. That's not coincidence. That's what happens when one person is navigating truth and the other is navigating control. So the ending wasn't clean. It couldn't be, because what you were walking away from wasn't just a person. It was a dynamic that blurred lines that turned simple truths into complicated questions. And even now, part of you may still revisit those moments, trying to piece together what was real and what was projection. But here's what changes everything. You don't need to reconstruct the entire past to validate your experience. You only need to recognize how it made you feel at your core. Not the explanations, not the justifications, the feeling. Because that feeling was honest. And honesty doesn't need perfect language to be real. While you were searching for clarity, they were navigating outcomes. While you were trying to understand, they were trying to maintain position. And that imbalance, that difference in intention, is exactly why the aftermath feels the way it does. Not because you lost, but because you refused to play a game that required you to abandon yourself. And now, as the dust settles, something becomes undeniable. You didn't walk away empty. You walked away aware. 8 of Swords appears reversed, right at that turning point, where the mind starts breaking out of its own confinement, where the blindfold loosens and the tight space around you begins to open. You can almost feel it, the tension that once surrounded your thoughts, the constant questioning, the loops that kept you circling, the same doubts. But now, something is different. The swords are still there, but they no longer define your limits, because the prison was never as solid as it felt. It was built from confusion, from mixed signals, from moments where your intuition spoke but was overshadowed by their version of reality. You weren't trapped by truth, you were navigating through distortion. And that's why it felt so heavy. Not because you were weak, but because clarity was constantly being interrupted. And now that interruption is fading. The questions that once kept you awake at night begin to lose their urgency. The need to understand every detail, every contradiction, every unexplained moment, it starts to dissolve. Not because you figured everything out, but because you no longer need to. That's freedom. Not knowing everything, but knowing enough to trust yourself. And this is where the shift becomes undeniable. You're no longer looking at the past trying to fix it. You're looking at it and finally seeing it for what it was. The patterns, the deflections, the subtle ways your clarity was challenged. It's all there now, not hidden, not blurred. And with that clarity comes something powerful. Detachment, not coldness, not indifference, but a grounded understanding that what happened does not define you, that what they did does not diminish you, that the confusion you carried was never a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of the environment you were placed in, and you've stepped out of it. While they may still be moving through that same mental maze trying to make sense of something they never fully understood, you are already beyond it. The space that once felt like a trap now feels like distance. Distance from chaos. Distance from distortion. Distance from anything that required you to question your own truth. And in that distance, something begins to return. Your clarity, your voice, your sense of self that doesn't need to be negotiated. Because the moment you stop trying to prove your reality to someone who couldn't meet you there was the moment you started reclaiming it for yourself. And that changes everything. 8 of coins reversed appears in that exact moment where effort was uneven, where something valuable was present but not nurtured, where what could have been built was instead neglected. You can almost picture it, a workspace left incomplete, tools scattered, attention drifting. The potential was there, but the discipline to honor it was missing. And that's the truth you're beginning to face. You were consistent in a place that wasn't. You invested energy into something that didn't meet you with the same level of care. Not because you didn't see the cracks, but because you believed in what it could become. You stayed with the process while they treated it like something temporary, and that imbalance leaves a mark. Because when effort isn't matched, it doesn't just slow progress, it distorts it. You find yourself compensating, adjusting, overextending, trying to maintain something that requires 2 steady hands, but is being held by one. And eventually something gives. Not because you failed, but because you were the only one truly building. That's why now as you step back, you begin to see the full picture. Not just the emotional disconnection, but the practical one. The missed opportunities, the lack of growth, the way something meaningful was handled like it was easily replaceable. But here's what they didn't understand. What you bring cannot be replicated through surface-level effort. What you carry requires awareness, presence, intention. And without those things, even the strongest foundation begins to weaken. So when they walked away or pushed things to the point where you had to, they didn't just lose connection. They lost access to something that was quietly elevating their life. Not in obvious ways, but in subtle, steady ways that only become visible once they're gone. And now in your absence, that absence begins to speak. The structure they once leaned on without noticing starts to shift. The ease they once experienced without questioning starts to fade. And the effort they never learned to give becomes the very thing they now lack. Meanwhile, you are no longer pouring into something that couldn't hold you. You are redirecting that energy. And that's where your power begins to compound. Because the same consistency you gave to them is now returning to you. And this time it won't be wasted. 9 of Swords reversed emerges right here in that dark space where the storm once lived inside your mind, where nights were heavy and thoughts refused to rest. You can almost see it, the swirling sky, the sharp blades suspended above the quiet figure beneath it all. But something has shifted. The storm is still there, but it no longer owns you. The weight is lifting not because everything is resolved, but because you've stopped carrying what was never yours to begin with. And that changes the entire landscape, because the anxiety you once held, the overthinking, the endless replaying of moments that wasn't weakness, it was your mind trying to make sense of something that didn't follow truth. You were searching for clarity in a space that was built on inconsistency. Now you're no longer searching there, and as you step out of that mental storm, you begin to notice something else. The noise you carried has quieted, but somewhere else it has grown louder. Not in your world, but in theirs. Because what you release doesn't disappear. It returns to where it originated. The confusion, the pressure, the unresolved tension. It doesn't just vanish into nothing. It finds its way back to the one who created it. Not as punishment, but as reflection. The same unrest that once lived in your thoughts now begins to echo in theirs. And they can't escape it the way you once tried to understand it, because you were willing to face it. They avoided it, and avoidance always delays, but never dissolves. So while you are stepping into a quieter mind, into a space where your thoughts begin to align with your truth again, they are stepping into the very storm they left behind. The same questions, the same unease, the same underlying tension, it begins to surface in ways they didn't anticipate. Not because of you, but because of what was left unresolved. And here is where your power becomes undeniable. You are no longer entangled in that storm. You are no longer trying to fix what was never yours to fix. You are no longer carrying the weight of someone else's inconsistency. Instead, you are reclaiming your peace. And peace once reclaimed doesn't negotiate. It doesn't return to chaos just to prove a point. It stands still. It anchors. It protects. So while they may still be navigating the consequences of what was mishandled, you are moving into something entirely different. A space where your mind is no longer your battlefield. A space where your energy is no longer divided. A space where what you give is finally received in alignment. And that is something they cannot access from where they stand now. Not because you blocked it, but because they walked away from it when they had the chance to understand it. Queen of Swords stands at this threshold, where emotion and truth finally meet without distortion, where the mind is no longer clouded by attachment, and the heart no longer confuses compassion with self-sacrifice. You can almost see her steady gaze, upright posture blade, held not in aggression, but in precision. There is no chaos around her, no noise, no need to explain herself to anyone who refuses to understand. And that is who you are becoming. Not hardened, not closed, but clear. Clear in a way that doesn't require validation. Clear in a way that sees through half-truths, through excuses, through patterns that once went unnoticed. The same sensitivity that once made you question yourself is now refined into discernment. You still feel deeply, but now you also see deeply. And that combination is power, because you are no longer approaching connection from a place of hope alone. You are approaching it with awareness. You are no longer giving endless chances to prove your worth. You are recognizing your worth before anything even begins. And that shift changes every interaction moving forward. You're no longer trying to be understood by someone unwilling to meet you in truth. You're no longer explaining your boundaries as if they require approval. You're no longer shrinking your clarity to maintain someone else's comfort. Instead, you hold your position, calmly, quietly, without needing to raise your voice. Because truth doesn't need volume. It needs alignment. And while you step into this version of yourself, something else becomes painfully clear on the other side. The person who once benefited from your openness now stands outside of it. The access they once had is gone not because you closed it abruptly, but because they failed to recognize its value when it was freely given. Now, even if they tried to return, they would not find the same doorway. Because you are no longer the same person standing there. You've learned, you've refined, you've seen what happens when your energy is given without equal awareness, and you are no longer available for that experience, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. And clarity doesn't go backwards. It doesn't pretend not to know what it knows. It doesn't reopen doors that led to confusion. So while they may still be trying to understand what they lost, trying to recreate something that no longer exists, you are already standing in a different space, a space where your truth leads, a space where your boundaries protect, a space where your presence is no longer something to be tested, but something to be respected. And that is the quiet authority they will never be able to access again in the same way. Knight of Swords reversed enters this space like a force that once moved recklessly, now exposed in its imbalance. Fast words without grounding, sharp actions without reflection, urgency without understanding. You can almost see it, a figure charging forward, blade raised but direction unclear, energy scattered, momentum disconnected from wisdom. And that is the energy you were dealing with. Not intentional clarity, not steady truth, but impulse disguised as certainty. That's why everything felt rushed at times, inconsistent at others. Moments of intensity followed by distance, words that felt convincing in the moment, but unraveled later. Decisions made quickly without depth, without anchoring. You were trying to build something real. They were reacting, and reaction cannot sustain what requires intention. So while you were moving with care, with awareness, with a desire to understand and grow, they were moving through waves of impulse, saying what felt right in the moment, doing what served them in the moment, without considering the long-term impact of those choices. That's not alignment, that's instability. And instability always reveals itself over time, which is exactly what you began to feel. The inconsistency, the emotional whiplash, the subtle sense that something wasn't grounded even when it appeared intense. That wasn't your imagination. That was your intuition recognizing a lack of foundation. And now from where you stand, it becomes even clearer, because you are no longer inside it. You are observing it, and observation brings understanding that involvement never could. You can now see how their energy moved, how it rushed, how it avoided stillness, how it replaced depth with speed. And more importantly, you can see how you adapted to that pace, how you tried to meet it, how you stretched yourself to keep up with something that was never steady to begin with. But you are no longer doing that. You have slowed down, you have grounded, you have returned to your own rhythm. And in that rhythm, there is no chaos, no urgency to prove, no need to chase clarity, because clarity is already present. So while they may still be caught in that same cycle, moving quickly, reacting, trying to outrun the consequences of their own inconsistency, you are standing still in a way that holds far more power, because stillness sees everything. Stillness understands everything. Stillness does not need to fight to be right. And from that stillness, you begin to recognize something even deeper. You were never meant to match their speed. You were meant to outgrow their direction. 6 of Coins appears here as a quiet restoration, a recalibration of what you give and what you receive. You can almost see it, a steady hand offering not out of desperation, not out of obligation, but from a place of grounded abundance. Around it, life responds. There is exchange, there is flow, there is balance, and that is what you are stepping back into. Because what you experienced before was not balance. You gave more, you adjusted more, you carried more. Not because you were meant to, but because you were placed in a dynamic that required it just to function. And over time, that kind of imbalance doesn't just drain energy, it distorts your sense of what is normal. But now, you are remembering. You are remembering that your energy was never meant to be poured endlessly into something that could not return it. You are remembering that your presence is not something to be earned through exhaustion. It is something to be met with equal presence. And this is where everything begins to shift again. Because as you return to balance, the way you give changes. You no longer give to be understood. You give where you are already seen. You no longer offer your energy to prove your value. You offer it where your value is recognized without explanation. And that distinction changes the entire flow of your life. Because now what comes toward you is different. Not because you are chasing something new, but because you are no longer available for what is misaligned. So while they may still be operating from imbalance, trying to take, to fill, to recreate, without truly understanding what was lost, you are stepping into a space where exchange becomes natural again, where what you give is returned, where what you build is supported, where what you are is matched. And this is the part they cannot replicate, because it was never just about you giving. It was about the balance you brought. And without that balance, nothing they try to build holds the same weight. But for you, that balance is returning, not through effort, but through alignment. And once alignment is restored, everything that was once forced begins to flow. Page of Swords stands at this threshold as a watcher, a quiet observer of truth, where curiosity sharpens into perception and innocence transforms into insight. You can almost see it, a figure holding a blade, not for battle, but for clarity, standing between shadow and light. Alert, aware, no longer naive to what hides beneath the surface. And that is who you are becoming now. You are no longer moving through life assuming everyone carries the same intention as you. You are no longer interpreting words at face value without sensing what sits behind them. You are listening differently, seeing differently, understanding differently, not from fear, but from awareness. Because what you went through taught you something deeper than pain. It taught you how to see. You've learned to notice the pauses in conversation, the inconsistencies in tone, the subtle shifts in energy that once went unnoticed. Not to judge, not to control, but to remain aligned with yourself no matter what stands in front of you. And this awareness is protection, not walls, not distance, but clarity that moves with you. So as you step into this next phase, something powerful happens. You are no longer reacting to what people show you on the surface. You are reading what exists beneath it, and that allows you to move with intention instead of assumption, which means the patterns that once held you no longer can, because now you see them before they take root. And while you move forward with this sharpened perception, something else unfolds quietly in the background. The people who once underestimated you, who thought your openness meant you wouldn't notice, who believed your patience meant you would stay, they begin to realize something they didn't expect. You were always aware. You were simply choosing to understand. But now that choice has changed. You are no longer trying to understand what harms you. You are recognizing it and stepping past it. And that is what separates this version of you from who you were before. Before you gave the benefit of the doubt. Now you give yourself the benefit of truth. Before you waited for clarity. Now you move with it. Before you hoped things would reveal themselves. Now you see them as they are. And that shift closes doors that once stayed open too long. Not out of anger, but out of evolution. Because you are no longer here to repeat the same lesson. You are here to embody what it taught you. And as you stand in that awareness, something becomes undeniable. You are no longer searching for answers in what happened. You are becoming the answer to what comes next. And becoming the answer to what comes next does not require noise or proof or anyone else's understanding. It requires stillness, a quiet returning to yourself. Because after everything, after the confusion, the questions, the weight you carried that was never truly yours, you are no longer standing in the same place. You are not the version of yourself who needed explanations to feel whole. You are the one who knows, not everything, but enough. Enough to trust the shift that happened within you. Enough to recognize that what ended was not your value but your misplacement. Enough to understand that what felt like loss was in truth a release from something that could not honor your depth. And that realization is where your peace begins to root itself. Chosen one, hear this clearly. You were never meant to stay where your spirit had to shrink to survive. You were never meant to beg for clarity where truth was being avoided. You were never meant to carry the weight of someone else's inability to meet you fully. What you walked through was not the end of your story. It was the refinement of your sight, the sharpening of your discernment, the quiet return to your own center. And now standing here, you don't need to look back to confirm what you already feel. The answers you once searched for in them are now settled within you. That is your closure. That is your power. So you move forward differently. Not hardened, but grounded. Not closed, but aligned. Not searching, but knowing. And if there is anything left to do, it is not to revisit what broke you. It is to honor what rebuilt you. Carry that. Walk with that. Let that quiet certainty guide you into everything that comes next, because what is aligned with you now will not require you to abandon yourself to receive it.